big welcome, Minette, to the Empathy Edge podcast. I'm so excited to talk to you about this idea and this concept of psychological safety because it is out there and many of us don't understand it. So welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Maria. I'm really happy to be here with you.
So before we kick off, can you tell us briefly what brought you to this work and to becoming an expert in psychological safety?
Oh, well, it's a rather long story that I'm going to try to make short. I spent 30 years in the software industry. And I started out as an individual contributor. I actually got my start as a technical writer. And I then worked my way up through various management positions. I ended up the last 5 years in the industry as the VP of engineering practice at Autodesk. And I was leading really large teams, like 3,500 engineers around the globe. And I had this interesting charter, and my charter was to get people to start working together in a very fragmented and siloed company to use common tools and to share code. And what I realized in this, 5-year journey of the job was that this was not a technical problem, although we had some technical challenges. It was about human behavior. It was about a willingness to listen to other viewpoints and not be right and not be convinced that your way was the only way. So that was part of it. It was like, how do we get people to collaborate? So I was just getting myself an education in collaboration and listening and communication and empathy. And all of those things came up for me. At the same time, here I was the first woman who had led engineering. I felt very much like I wasn't part of the insiders club. I'd been mentoring a lot of women. I was increasingly working with people from other underrepresented communities. And I was, we were just starting to really talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, sort of the preliminary days of it. And I was finding myself just being more and more of a champion for all of us who felt like we didn't have a voice. And I cannot tell you how many meetings I was a part of, and probably many that I led myself, where I didn't feel I could speak up, where I could really, challenge when I disagreed. And I'm sure people in my organization didn't always feel that way either. So I came across, I think, I can't remember the order, but I was doing some research for a keynote that I was giving. And I found the research that Google had done on psychological safety, Project Aristotle, which is well known. And I also found Amy Edmondson's work, which Google found when they were doing their research. And her book came out sometime in that time frame, the Fearless Organization. So I just started realizing that, psychological safety is a term I didn't know before. And yet it is just fundamental to all of the things that I was trying to work on, including collaboration and including inclusion and equity, that without this feeling, and maybe I'll just define it right here so we really are on the same page, without the feeling that in this team, this is a safe place for me to ask a question, speak up if I disagree, challenge the dominant viewpoint without fear of being excluded, being embarrassed, being marginalized. So that's basically it. And although it sounds like, I kind of don't like the term because it sounds so geeky and academic, but the way I come back to it is a deeply human experience. And all of us really need to feel heard and seen and valued and respected for who we are. And without that foundation of psychological safety, where, yes, I can have a different viewpoint, I can dissent, I can challenge, then what happens is we all hold back and we don't share our gifts with the world. We don't share what's unique about us. We don't share our experience and our unique mind. And the organization doesn't benefit from everything we have to offer. So that's how I came to it. And then ultimately, I won't share the full story, but I felt that my voice was no longer really welcome after a certain point. Leadership changes, things change within an organization. And I felt like the way I was challenging was maybe a bit much. And I left. I left in 2019. And I had to do a lot of soul searching about what's important to me after I actually didn't think I would start my own business because I'd been inside for 30 years, right? Kind of institutionalized in working for a company. But I felt like, what's really important to me is everything I have learned over these decades. I want to share with other leaders because I actually believe most managers and leaders want to do the right thing. They want to have high performing teams and engaged employees, but they don't know how. Yeah. And I feel like, we don't train managers. I was never properly trained as a manager. I learned through, a few classes here and there and watching role models and also seeing really poor role models and what I didn't want to do. And I felt like we should just do a better job job of training managers. And so, I started this work on inclusive leadership, and I do speaking and workshops to try to help more managers do better.
Wow, so much to unpack there. But yeah, I mean, I think it's so important. I too came from having worked for other people my entire career and having great success with that, and then sort of got thrust into entrepreneurship. And when you think back, you realize that so much of when you felt like you were in a dysfunctional environment was really about not feeling psychologically safe. And I kind of equate that, I don't know if this is wrong to do this, but I feel like it's so closely linked with trust. Because if I trust the people I'm working with and my manager, I know I can take risks. I know I can play devil's advocate. I know I can disagree. And so I never in my mind thought of it in terms of safety before, but it is true. It's about, what do I feel okay with revealing about myself, with contributing to the conversation. And we lose out. I mean, if we need to make the business case, it's similar as it is for empathy. We lose out on innovation. We lose out on engagement. Like, this is not just some like woo-woo fluffy thing. It's, if people don't speak up, they don't contribute their gifts. And if they see a project going off the rails, they don't warn you. They don't say anything because they don't want to be that person that is doom and gloom, right? So, but if you have a trusting environment, you can say what you mean, you can mean what you say, you can be okay with a little bit of conflict, a little bit of disagreement. And most importantly, from an inclusivity perspective, you can feel okay with being yourself and bringing yourself to work and any of your identities, whether you're gay or straight or trans, whatever religion you are, whatever nationality you are, whatever race you are. And then you're able to contribute that point of view to make better business decisions, because you might see things differently than another person does. So I love the work that you're doing. And I want to talk about, I actually have a quirky question for you.
Yeah.
Can you have an inclusive culture if people don't feel psychologically safe? And vice versa, if people don't feel like you have an inclusive culture, can they still feel like it's a psychologically safe place to be? Or do you have to have all or none?
So first of all, I love that you asked that. I don't think it's quirky at all. I believe, and I'm not alone in this, but I really believe that they are intrinsically linked, and that you do not get inclusion without psychological safety, and vice versa. If you had to put one first, I guess I would say that maybe the safety is the first level of getting to inclusion, right? Because you do have to feel safe to show who you are and how you think. But they're very, very closely linked. And I think, there's so much emphasis on diversity and diversity hiring. But what companies and organizations and often managers forget about is that, are you going to really benefit from the diverse talent that you've hired if you don't work really hard on creating that safe and inclusive culture? And my answer is no. And in fact, work on that culture as your starting point, because anyone who comes in and sees that this is not a place where I can actually challenge things and speak up, they're not going to stick around, or they'll check out.
Absolutely. And I know that, with your book, the Psychological Safety Playbook, I love that it is a playbook, because I think there's many leaders nodding their heads going, okay, yeah, I'm on board. I want to create a psychologically safe culture. How do I do that?
Exactly. So, that's why we wrote the book.
Well, yes. Number one, where would you start? How could you start realistically and without doing harm? Assess if you do have assess the level of psychological safety in your organization. Because I would imagine that the first step is to get the pulse of where we are now.
Yeah. And there's a very simple assessment. In fact, how I came to end up writing this book with Caroline Helbig, who's in Germany, is that we got a certification in running assessments based on Amy Edmondson's work. There's 7 questions, essentially. She includes them in her book, The Fearless Organization. And they basically give you a score of psychological safety across 4 dimensions. And it's a great place, especially I found for any organization that feels that data is important. It's a great data point to say, this is where this team is today in terms of psychological safety. I don't recommend doing an assessment and then saying, okay, we're good, right? Because the thing is really, what do you do with the data? And so for me, it's like, okay, what are we going to do? Even if you have a relatively high score, there's always something to be done. So without action afterwards, it's just data for data's sake. But it's a great way to come into an org totally anonymous, practitioners like me, and there I don't know, there may be 100 people who are now certified in the methodology. We can come in, it's utterly anonymous. We're the only ones who have access to the data. And then we can come in and facilitate a conversation with a team. And I think it's really, for me, it's funny. Like, it almost doesn't matter what the data is. It's having that first conversation and opening the door to talking about what's really going on here.
Can you actually assess if the environment is not psychologically safe, though? Will people be honest in their answers?
Well, it depends if they believe in anonymity.
Got it.
It's, that's the thing. Like, that's also true on employee surveys. Like, I remember back when I was at Autodesk, we would run these big surveys, and some people were like, I don't believe it's anonymous, right? So if that's the case, that's going to be the case everywhere. But if they can really be convinced, honestly, it's anonymous, no one's going to know. The other thing that's interesting about it is that if there are extremes in the data, the way this survey works is that you throw out the extremes when you show the team their data, so that no one's going to be there like, okay, what if I scored 0, and they're going to know who it is. So if there's one person who scores 0, we're not going to show that when we talk.
Right. I think, well, I mean, not that the show's about plugging, but I think that it's important to have someone external come in and conduct that and facilitate that data. Someone who doesn't have any political skin in the game.
Exactly.
I think that that's important for accuracy of the data, right? So tell me a little bit about how you see psychological safety manifesting itself. So can you give us some examples of markers of, if you see this, or if folks listening know this is part of their environment, they can feel somewhat good about the fact that there's aspects of psychological safety happening in their workplace?
Yeah, there's some really, I would say they're almost tells about psychological safety. So one is like, if a leader of a team, can be a C-level, it can be a first-line manager, it can be anyone in between. But if a leader of a team actually invites dissent and other viewpoints, and really actively invites it. And like in our playbook, we actually say, if you're a leader, one of the things you should do is ask the question, what am I missing? Right? Because you really want to get those other points of view. And then if those leaders actually listen without getting defensive, but
empathy.
Truly, yes, exactly. With curiosity, with wanting to understand and seeking to understand as opposed to refute or to put their viewpoint forward. That's one tell. Another tell, and I remember, this is something that I remember from early in my career, and I didn't know at all what it was at the time, but it was so special. I was part of a team way back in the early days of Silicon Valley, and we had a super high level of psychological safety. And these were the markers of that team. We were cross-functional. We all had different talents. We were very egalitarian, even in how we ran meetings. So without anyone coming in and telling us to do this, we took turns taking notes. And you certainly probably know this, Maria, in many settings, it's the women and the marginalized people who do the office housework, which is note-taking is one of those things. We were a group of men and women, and we all took turns taking notes. No one had the burden every time. We also, without formalizing it, we really had equal talking time. And that's also a marker of psychological safety, that every single member of the team speaks more or less equally. But here's the opposite marker, which is really common, is that you're in a group of 10 and 2 or 3 people dominate the conversation and the other 7 or 8 hold back. You can even see in their body language, they're sitting back, they're not speaking up. And that's generally a sign that there's something going on here and it's probably not fully safe. Another marker of an unsafe environment is that you have the meeting. And I talk about meetings because so much of how we live out our culture is in meetings, right? And it manifests, like what happens in meetings is kind of what's the culture is all about. If you're in a meeting and, let's say the leader got up and said, this is what we're doing this quarter. And, this is what I expect of all of you. And everyone nods their head and said, yeah, we're on board. And you walk out of the room, or you have the Slack afterwards. And it's like, there's no way in hell this is ever going to work. It's the meeting after the meeting.
Yeah.
But no one was comfortable speaking up inside the actual meeting. That's a lack of psychological safety.
Right.
Now, I could go on and on, but I'm going to give one more, which I think is important. And that is, a sign of a psychologically safe team. And that is that people do disagree with one another and that they can argue in a respectful way. So it's not, and this is where the fine line is that people are not being unnatural naturally polite with one another. When people are super polite and cautious, it's probably because they don't feel safe. When you can have a heated argument, but it's not personal, it's like, Maria, I see things from a totally different point of view. Is it okay if I share that? But I'm not attacking you and saying, Maria, you're an idiot for saying that, right? So it's not making people feel badly about their perspective, but it's like, I have a very different viewpoint. It can be a heated argument, and we have a way to get through it. And no one feels hurt or rejected or marginalized after that.
Right. I'm wondering too, this is bringing to mind the role of humor in the workplace. And I had a lovely guest on the show about 2 years ago, Kathy Klotz-Guest, who you may be familiar with. She speaks a lot about being human and injecting principles of improv and comedy into your culture, but for the purpose of creating trust. But she also talks about the fact that you can't just inject humor into your culture if there is no trust. So they're very closely aligned. I'm wondering if that's one of your markers at all, if colleagues can joke around with each other, if managers and their direct reports can joke around with each other and sort of kid each other and roast each other. Is that a sign that it's psychologically safe?
Yeah, generally. In fact, we have that in our book, and there's good evidence about that. I thought you were going to mention Naomi Bagdonis and Jennifer Aker, who have a book about humor at work, and I forget what it's called, but we reference it in the playbook. But yes, humor is a sign that we're safe, especially when, we can make fun of ourselves, for our leaders to actually laugh at themselves and then at one another. And I go back to that same team I was mentioning that I was a part of. We joked around all the time, and we would have like our little ways of kidding each other, and they would be like, it would be about my quirks and their quirks, but it was never hurtful. It was because we cared about each other. We knew each other. We trusted each other. And I will come back to your mention of improv. So improv, we include sort of that yes and, that yes and concept from improv in our playbook. I'll tell you a story of when I was leading a team. I was leading a really senior team at Autodesk, and I had one of these leadership offsites. And I had a group that was, honestly, we were pretty fragmented. I had inherited a bunch of functions. So I had like senior directors who all reported to me, and they all led different functions. And we couldn't figure out how to come together as a team. It was just like a bunch of silos. And I had this offsite. And one of the people in my organization is an improv actor. And she actually is in San Francisco and does improv regularly on the weekends. And I invited her in for a half day. And we did improv. And, the funny thing about it is that I had a group of some very, very serious introverts and engineers who, like, if I had said to them, we're going to do improv tomorrow, they would have called in sick. They wouldn't have shown up. So on our agenda, we just had like team activity, right?
Right.
But it just, like, we all laughed in the most outrageous ways because, first of all, we all made ourselves look like idiots, but it was very low risk. So with humor, I think part of like getting levity into the environment and making it safe is it has to be very low risk, and you have to be like, we're either all going to be embarrassed together or no one's going to be embarrassed, and so what we were doing was like very simple, silly things. And then we all laughed together, and it was incredibly bonding. And the result of that, so it wasn't just that we laughed for half a day and then went back to work.
Yeah.
But the result of that was every time we had a staff meeting after that, when we started to get into a conversation where someone was like putting someone down, which would happen, or not listening, or like talking over, we had this code language that we started to use, and we would just all say yes and just to remind ourselves of like the power of building on one another as opposed to tearing each other down, and the yes but it's never going to work. Yes and is just like, from improv, is such a powerful way to really be inclusive to all the ideas and to hear all the voices. So we took that forward, and I think it really made a big difference in our team dynamics.
I love it so much. And I think we've kind of danced around it, but what is the importance of empathy in creating that psychologically safe environment?
Oh, well, I think it's so intrinsically linked, like with inclusion, because we have to care about the experiences of the people around us. And really that's what empathy is in a nutshell, is that we can't, and the other thing about the myth of like walking in someone else's shoes, you can't, but you have to try to imagine what they're going through. You have to care about what they're going through in order to make it safe for them. And so, like, for example, like, if here I was a white woman in a leadership position, and I was dealing with people from underrepresented groups, I don't know what it's like to be a Black man or an Asian woman in the workplace, but I know that they're dealing with things I'm not. And I need to care about their experience, even if I cannot live their life, you know?
Right.
And so I think that's just the caring about other people's experiences and trying, you know, the compassion that goes along with empathy so often is that I want to make it better. And I care that you're having a good experience, and I care that we collectively are all having a good experience. So that's why I think they're very, very closely linked.
So I have kind of an interesting question that I've been hearing from a lot of leaders who are sold on wanting to be more empathetic. And you and I may have talked about this in the past, but the challenge they're having is that in their quest to be more empathetic leaders, they are finding that they're being met with employees who are sort of using the psychology as a weapon. They're using empathy as a weapon in terms of, you know, there's a difficult business decision that has to be enforced, or there's something you have to do as a worker, you know, you're being expected to do, you're being asked to do. And the rebuttal is, well, I don't feel safe, or you're not respecting my boundaries. And, you know, they start raising all these red flag HR issues, and they're kind of wielding it as a weapon of being able to get out of doing the thing that they don't want to do, or adhering to the policy they don't want to adhere to. Would you have any advice for someone who is fearing that, or who's facing that, in that, you know, so where do I go from there? If I'm being met with, if I'm trying all the things to create this psychologically safe environment, I'm trying to connect with my team, I'm trying to be empathetic, give them a wide berth, you know, understand their needs and their frustrations and their goals. And yet I need them to do the work I need them to do. Do you have any advice?
Yeah. And, you know, at this, I would say it's really interesting that you said like it's being empathy as a term is being weaponized. So is psychological safety.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So definitely. And it's sort of the excuse for all behavior. And I mean, even recently, people, you know, with all the recent layoffs in Silicon Valley, people saying, you know, there goes our psychological safety. They did layoffs, you know, and it's like, I think that there's this myth both around empathy, around inclusion, around psychological safety, that we're wrapping everyone in a protective bubble and nothing bad can ever happen.
Right.
And that's obviously not true. And I think with empathy and with psychological safety, I think for leaders, what I would say is like, I would actually talk about these things openly, like what psychological safety and what empathetic leadership mean, what they are and what they aren't. So it doesn't mean that nothing bad is going to ever happen. It also doesn't mean I am not holding you accountable for what we've agreed on. What it does mean is that if you're struggling, we're going to talk about it. I'm not going to just give you, you know, a terrible review at the end of the quarter or the year.
Right.
We're going to talk about how I can help you, how I can help you be successful, how I can clear barriers, which all managers should be doing.
Right.
And you are going to uphold your end of the bargain. And that's true for everybody. So accountability in some ways is actually, if you're in a safe environment, a psychologically safe environment, you should be able to talk really openly about this. And it's like, okay, you're not holding up your end of the bargain. What do we need to do collectively to make sure you can? What's getting in the way? But we got to talk about this. We're not going to go dark, and we're not going to pretend nothing's going on here. So yeah, I think we just need to really talk about it and have leaders. This is why I think the training is so important, to get leaders more equipped to have these conversations with their teams, to have the vocabulary and the understanding to talk about it. Because I think they don't, like right now, it's pretty scary to be called out as like, you're not creating a safe environment, or
right.
You're not an empathetic leader.
There's fears of litigation, like to be honest. And it's very, you know, you hear as a leader these trigger words, and you're like, okay, we're shutting this conversation down right now. I've heard of leaders that have done that, right?
Yes.
And so that's difficult. And I think that you're right. It's being able to have the conversation and sort of call it out ahead of time and explain, let's all agree what we mean by empathetic leadership. Let's all agree what we mean by psychological safety, and not at the point that you need to define it.
Exactly. That's right. I mean, I really believe, like, you know, it's great to read articles together as a team, you know, whether you read, you know, your book or our book, or you read some articles about the topics, or even like read the report on empathy, you know, the one that
the state of workplace empathy,
empathy report, like,
or listen to podcasts,
or listen to podcasts. Exactly. There are lots of resources, but to do that as a group, to make sure that like everyone's on the same page, and let's talk about this. Like, let's spend one of our staff meetings talking about what this means and what it means specifically for us as a team.
Oh, I love that advice. I think that's great. I mean, I think so many so many leaders try different things to do as a group, where it's like forced fun activities, or like, let's start a book let's start a book club. But I love this sort of short sprint of, let's read an article, let's bring a speaker in, let's listen to a podcast, but let's do it together. And then let's discuss it together. Yeah. What did we learn? What were the insights? What did you walk away with? And I feel like, and maybe this is not the way to go about it, but I'm a very process-driven person. And I feel like all of these things we're talking about when we're talking about inclusive cultures or psychological safety or empathetic leadership, they're just sort of these series of contracts with each other on how we're going to get the work done, not just what work needs to get done, but let's all make sure we are crystal clear. We as business owners, as vendors, have contracts that spell out our terms. We need more contracts within the workplace, I think. Nothing laborious or litigious, but just more of that, making sure everyone's on the same page and they're committing very clearly to the same thing. I think there's so much assumption on, I hired Minette, she should know that I expect this or that I expect that, or they should know that's how we do things around here. And all these unsaid rules that are just all these assumptions we make. I feel like if we could have more, sub mini sprint contracts with each other around these different themes, our workplaces would actually be better. It might make people roll their eyes a little bit, but I don't know. What do you think of that?
I think you're onto something because, for example, here's a simple example and it could be extended to lots of different things. But I really believe, and we talk about it in our book, that it's really helpful to have ground rules for meetings.
Yes.
How are we going to run our meetings? Because then we know, okay, if we want to raise our hand, are we going to raise our hands if we want to talk? Are we going to go around the virtual table? But establish ground rules, because then everyone knows. And then the other thing that's powerful about that is you can go, you know what? We're not actually upholding our ground rules. And you can call someone out in it in a respectful way because you've collectively agreed to them. And 100%. I think there should be more, like to your point, I think there should be more norms. They're basically team norms of how we behave. How do we deal with missed deadlines? How do we deal with failure, which is a really big aspect of building psychological safety, that we can actually talk about failure and put some of these agreements. And I think they shouldn't come top down. They should be co-created with the team so that everyone buys into them and we agree, like, okay, this is how we're going to do a blameless postmortem, or, whatever it is. This is how our one-on-ones are going to go, and to agree to these things.
And nobody wants to take the time to do that. Everyone's moving too fast, but it would actually save us so much time and heartache if we would just have those discussions up front of like, how are we going to work together? How are we going to communicate together? How are we going to make hybrid and in-person employees equitable in meetings, in projects, in FaceTime with executives? We skip over those things because we think they don't matter, but they actually are the things that matter the most to the success or failure of the initiatives.
Yes, they do. And I've seen it be successful. It has to be sustained.
Yes.
Sometimes there's like this initial enthusiasm for it. Like, we've agreed on our meeting ground rules. I saw a small company. They were quite smart, but they had them on the wall of their conference room, and they would start off the meeting by reading them aloud. And that's actually great. Like, it wasn't long. It wasn't a long list, but it's like, okay, let's just remind ourselves. And that's smart, because it's like, okay, we're going to reestablish that we agree to this before we get into the heart of our meeting. And then if someone, if we say there's a no interruption rule, then we're going to be like, hold on, Maria just didn't finish her thought. Let's let her finish before we move on. And so you can reinforce the rules as you go.
Mm-hmm. And you don't feel guilty for doing it.
No.
If everyone's clear about it. You can be the enforcer if you want to be the enforcer.
It actually makes
if you
it
feel
safe
comfortable.
to do
Yeah,
it.
exactly.
Yeah, because one of the ground rules should be any one member of this team can and should call out when we're not following the rules.
Mm-hmm.
So you're empowering everyone, and it's not like scary to do.
Right.
Yeah.
What's sort of a last little golden nugget you would leave people with if they're embarking on, okay, we want to do what we can and really put focus on creating a psychologically safe environment so that our people can thrive? What's a piece of advice you have as they start that journey?
Well, I would say that starting anywhere, like the thing is that you can get overwhelmed, and I don't want anyone to be overwhelmed. So start, one place is start by being a better listener, and to listen with true curiosity, with full attention, and with the willingness to understand a viewpoint that is different from your own. That's a great place to start. Start by asking for dissent. They're just little things you can do. And our playbook has 25 of those ideas in them. So the way we wrote it is that you can pick it up anywhere. Like today, I'm actually struggling with meetings. I'm going to go to the section on inclusive rituals, and I'm going to find out one thing I can do today to run a better meeting. And the idea is start anywhere and then practice and see what works. And if something doesn't work for you, try another thing. And there are lots of ideas that we have for you. And we don't have the exhaustive list, of course. This is just a starting point. But be willing, I guess what I would say is be willing to try it out over a sustained period of time, because you don't flip a switch. You don't come into a room and say, this is a safe environment. It happens only over time when people see repeatedly that there will be no ramifications for my speaking up or speaking out. And they really do want to hear my point of view. And as they start to believe that, they will feel safer. And it will be, this virtuous circle. But it takes time, and it takes consistency, and it takes practice.
So good. So good. Thank you, Minette, for all of these insights today. Again, folks, the book is called The Psychological Safety Playbook. And you're working on a second book that's going to be coming out in 2023, The Boldly Inclusive Leader. Would you say that that's kind of a companion book to the first one?
Yeah, it's a bigger book. So the Psychological Safety Playbook by design is really short and really accessible. Mm-hmm. The Boldly Inclusive Leader is a full-length business book that I've been writing for a long time, and I finally finished it. And it has a chapter on psychological safety in it. So it's basically just a more comprehensive book on my views on what everything is what's entailed in becoming a boldly inclusive leader. And that one comes out in August.
Love it. Love it so much. Well, thank you again. We will have all your links in the show notes for folks to check out your book and get in touch with you on social. But for folks on the go right now, where's the best place they can go to learn more about your work?
Yeah, my website, MinetteNorman.com, is a great place to start. And I'd love for you to connect with me on LinkedIn too.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me, Maria. It's been a great conversation. I feel like we could talk for hours.
We could. This topic is near and dear to my heart, especially having been scarred by non-psychologically safe workplaces in the past.
Haven't we all?
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for listening to another wonderful episode of the Empathy Edge podcast. If you like what you heard, you know what to do. Please rate and review it and share it with your friends and colleagues. And until next time, remember that cash flow, creativity, and compassion are not mutually exclusive. Take care and be kind.